The chamber was large enough to make most species uncomfortable. Not because of what was inside it. Because of how much empty space there was above. The ceiling of the Galactic Conclave Hall climbed upward for nearly half a kilometer before disappearing into a pale blue haze of atmospheric regulators and light panels. The architects had designed it that way deliberately. The conclave represented 312 civilizations, many of which were significantly larger than humans and several of which had strong opinions about ceilings that felt too close. So the solution had been simple. Make the room enormous. Rows of curved platforms formed wide rings around a central speaking floor. Each platform was built to accommodate a different physiology. Some were padded for creatures with soft underbodies. Others were reinforced with thick alloy for species whose mass could crack ordinary flooring. A few platforms floated slightly above the surface, humming quietly to support delegates who preferred not to touch the ground at all. Every seat in the hall was occupied. Eyes watched the center floor. Hundreds of them. Some were faceted and glittering like cut glass. Others were smooth black pools. A few glowed faintly in the dim light. There were stalked eyes, compound eyes, thermal sensors, and sensory membranes that pulsed gently with chemical analysis. All of them were focused on the same place. The speaker's podium. The creature standing there was from the Veth Dominion, a tall, jointed being with 6 limbs and a torso that widened toward the middle like a piece of sculpted machinery. His speaking apparatus sat halfway down his body, which meant his voice emerged from somewhere that was not his head. This was mildly unsettling to species who expected mouths to be attached to faces. He had been speaking for 5 hours and 43 minutes. The translation matrix floating above the chamber continued its work tirelessly, converting the Veth language into 300 standardized dialects. A half-second delay accompanied each sentence as the system processed meaning, tone, and contextual implications. The result was that every statement arrived twice. Once in the original language, which sounded like metallic hinges moving under tension. And again in translation. This second version was far clearer. It was also considerably more insulting. Therefore, the translated voice continued smoothly, the Veth Dominion maintains that the human proposal demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of large-scale corridor logistics. The speaker lifted 4 of his limbs in a sweeping gesture meant to indicate patience, and further suggests that humanity's continued insistence on this amendment reflects either a profound lack of technical comprehension or an emotional response inconsistent with responsible diplomatic conduct. The room remained silent. Most delegations were used to this tone by now. The Veth Dominion had a reputation for explaining things at length. At the human delegation table, Ambassador Yara Oae stopped writing. The human section of the chamber was comparatively simple. 8 chairs arranged behind a long dark table. 8 datapads. 8 small flags representing Earth's diplomatic authority. The flags were about the size of paperback books. Yara thought they looked ridiculous. She had mentioned this during her first year at the conclave. The protocol office had informed her that the flags were non-negotiable. That had been 9 years ago. She had since stopped mentioning them. Across the table, Marcus Hale leaned back slightly in his chair. His posture carried the particular stillness of someone who had spent most of his adult life inside diplomatic rooms and had learned that visible reactions were rarely helpful. He slid a folded sheet of paper across the table toward Yara. Actual paper. Humans occasionally used it when they did not want the station's recording systems to archive their thoughts. Yara unfolded it. Marcus's handwriting was precise. Day 411 of active sessions. Veth presentation. Slide 72. Total slides, 109. Yara stared at the note for a moment. Then she looked back toward the center of the hall. The Veth speaker continued. As clearly demonstrated by the statistical models provided in Section 17 of this presentation. Behind him, a massive projection displayed charts, equations, and trade flow simulations stretching across multiple star systems. None of it was technically incorrect. That was the frustrating part. Marcus tapped his pen lightly against the table. "Do you think," he murmured without looking at her, "we'll reach slide 100 before the heat death of the universe?" Yara did not answer. Her gaze remained on the speaker, on the charts, on the endless explanation of why humanity's logistical restructuring proposal was unnecessary, inefficient, and naive. She closed her datapad. The sound was small. A soft click. Marcus noticed immediately. After 9 years working beside her, he had developed a particular sensitivity to small sounds. He looked at the closed datapad. Then at her. "Yara," he said quietly. She stood up. Her chair slid back across the floor with a faint scraping noise that was completely insignificant in a room this size. Except that it was not insignificant at all. Because for the first time in 11 years of conclave sessions, a human delegate had stood up while another species was still speaking. The Veth speaker continued talking. The translation matrix continued translating. But several hundred alien delegates suddenly found their attention drifting away from the presentation slides and toward the human table. Yara picked up her stylus, her datapad, and the small flag beside her seat. She tucked the flag under her arm. Then she turned toward the exit and began to walk. Ambassador Yara Oae walked toward the exit with the steady pace of someone leaving a meeting that had simply run its course. Not a protest. Not a statement. Just the quiet conclusion of a very long conversation. Behind her, the Veth speaker continued. And if the human delegation would take the time to review the models more carefully. The translation matrix repeated the sentence in clear galactic standard. But something had changed in the room. A ripple of attention spread outward from the human table. Delegates who had been half listening to the presentation now watched Yara cross the polished floor of the chamber. The conclave hall was large enough that walking from the human section to the exit took nearly 20 seconds. 20 seconds was a long time when several hundred alien representatives were watching you. Yara reached the aisle between the seating platforms. She did not hurry. She did not look back. At the human table, Marcus Hale exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered under his breath. "Here we go." He folded the note he had given her earlier and slid it into his jacket pocket. Then he closed his datapad, capped his pen, and stood. The chair behind him moved back with a soft scrape of composite against the floor. 2 seconds later, the next human delegate stood. Then another. And another. They did not exchange glances. They did not signal. The conclave surveillance analysts would later spend weeks examining the recording, searching for evidence of coordination. They would find none. The humans simply rose from their seats one by one, like passengers leaving a bus. 8 chairs, 8 datapads, 8 small flags. Within half a minute, all of them were empty. By the time the last human delegate reached the aisle, the Veth speaker had finally stopped talking. His upper limbs remained raised in mid-gesture. Therefore, the translation matrix finished dutifully, the Dominion concludes that the proposed amendment. The system paused. There were no more words to translate. The silence that followed felt larger than the room itself. At the center podium, the Veth speaker slowly lowered his limbs. "What," he asked after a moment, "is the meaning of this?" No one answered. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The grand facilitator of the conclave, an elderly seer whose species had been practicing diplomacy longer than most civilizations had possessed electricity, leaned forward slightly. His 4 hands rested calmly on the table before him. "Ambassador Oae," he called toward the departing humans, "perhaps you would care to explain." The chamber door closed. The sound echoed faintly through the enormous hall. For several seconds, no one spoke. The Veth representative rotated his torso slowly toward the grand facilitator. "This behavior," he said stiffly, "is highly irregular." "Indeed," the facilitator replied. Across the chamber, a delegate from the Heron Coalition leaned toward his neighbor. "Are humans prone to this sort of emotional reaction?" His neighbor, a representative of the Drell Systems Union, considered the question. "Not particularly," she said. "They have attended these sessions for 11 years without incident." "Then perhaps," the Heron suggested, "they simply require time to reconsider their position." The Veth speaker gave a short, dismissive movement with 2 of his limbs. "Yes," he said. "That seems the most reasonable interpretation." Several other delegations murmured agreement. Humanity had always been a curious presence within the conclave. They were not the strongest military power represented in the chamber. They were not the wealthiest. They were not even among the oldest civilizations. But they were persistent. Where other species sent representatives who changed every few years, humans tended to keep the same diplomats for decades. Where others treated negotiations as contests of prestige, humans approached them like engineering problems. Patiently, methodically, and occasionally to the point of irritation. Over the past decade, the human delegation had submitted an unusual number of proposals. Procedural reforms, logistics frameworks, arbitration structures, suggestions for improving the efficiency of trade corridors that spanned dozens of systems. Most of these proposals had been discussed at length, then tabled, or referred to committees, or placed on future agendas. The conclave was very good at discussing things. The Veth speaker adjusted the projection behind him. "Well," he said, "if the human delegation wishes to absent themselves from this discussion, that is their decision." He turned back toward the chamber. "Shall we continue?" The presentation resumed. Charts returned to the display. Trade models scrolled across the projection. But something had shifted. Delegates who had previously listened with polite detachment now found their attention drifting toward the empty human table. 8 chairs, 8 datapads, 8 small flags standing neatly in their holders. The Veth speaker moved on to slide 73. "Now," he continued, "if we examine the projected freight volumes for the outer corridor over the next 20 standard cycles." The translation matrix repeated his words in calm, neutral tones. The session continued for another 4 hours. By the time it ended, most of the delegates had convinced themselves that the situation was not particularly important. Humans were a useful species. Energetic, hard-working, occasionally stubborn. But the conclave had operated for 3 centuries. It would continue to operate tomorrow. And the day after that. A single delegation leaving early from one session was hardly a crisis. At the close of the meeting, the Grand Facilitator looked once more toward the human table. Still empty. He made a small note in the session record. Then he closed the proceedings. Across the station, in a quiet transit bay far from the conclave chamber, a small diplomatic shuttle disengaged from its docking clamps. Its engines warmed to life. And without ceremony, without announcement, and without sending a single message to the conclave, the entire human delegation left the station. The conclave did not notice humanity's absence immediately. For the first few days, nothing seemed unusual. Sessions continued. Committees met. Reports were filed, revised, and discussed in circles that stretched endlessly through the station's bureaucratic halls. The conclave had been designed to move slowly. 3 centuries of diplomacy had created an institution that valued stability above speed. Every decision passed through layers of review, advisory panels, and procedural confirmations designed to prevent mistakes. Or, as some critics quietly observed, to prevent anything from happening at all. At first, the missing human delegation was simply noted in the attendance records. Day 1, absent. Day 2, absent. Day 3, absent. By the 4th day, the facilitator's office sent a polite inquiry to Earth's diplomatic office. The response arrived 12 hours later. It was short. The human delegation has concluded its participation in current conclave proceedings. No explanation. No complaints. No request for renegotiation. Just a statement of fact. For most delegations, the message barely registered. Humanity represented only one voice among hundreds. Their absence was mildly inconvenient for committees where they had been active, but the conclave had operated without individual species before. Meetings were rescheduled. Working groups were reassigned. Life moved on. But a few delegates remembered something. The first time humanity had presented the proposal. It had been 11 years earlier. At the time, the idea had seemed almost trivial. A restructuring of the Galactic Trade Corridor Network. The proposal suggested replacing the existing hub-based freight system with a distributed relay model designed to handle exponential growth in cargo traffic. The human report had been meticulous. Thousands of pages. Detailed simulations. Economic projections spanning 100 cycles. At the center of the proposal was a single concern. The current trade network would fail. Not tomorrow. Not next year. But eventually. The system had been designed centuries earlier when interstellar traffic volumes were a fraction of their current levels. Every decade since then had increased the load on the network. More ships, more cargo, more systems connecting to the trade grid. The infrastructure had expanded, but the core architecture remained unchanged. Human analysts had identified several key choke points. If traffic continued growing at its current rate, those nodes would begin to overload. First gradually, then catastrophically. The human solution was radical. Instead of relying on a handful of massive central hubs, they proposed creating thousands of smaller relay stations distributed across the network. Freight would move in flexible chains rather than converging through single bottlenecks. It was elegant, efficient, and extremely disruptive to the existing system. Implementing it would require rebuilding a large portion of the trade infrastructure that many powerful species had spent centuries constructing. The initial response from the conclave had been polite interest, followed by discussion, then debate, then committees. The Veth Dominion had produced a 72-slide analysis explaining why the proposal was unnecessary. The Heron Coalition had suggested forming a task force to review the economic implications. The Drell Systems Union recommended additional modeling before making any structural changes. The process continued, year after year. Each session produced more reports, more presentations, more analysis explaining why immediate action was premature. Meanwhile, the humans kept bringing data. Every cycle, their projections were updated. Traffic increased. Cargo volume rose. The margin of safety within the network shrank. 9 years ago, Ambassador Yara OA had delivered a quiet warning during a mid-cycle session. The system, she had said calmly, is approaching nonlinear stress thresholds. The phrase had been unfamiliar to many delegates. One of the Veth analysts had asked her to clarify. It means, Yara explained, that failure will not occur gradually. She paused before continuing. When the tipping point arrives, the network will not slow down. It will collapse. The room had gone quiet for a moment. Then the debate resumed. More studies were requested. More simulations. More time. 2 years ago, the humans submitted their final report. The document contained a revised projection. Traffic levels had reached 94% of the maximum safe capacity for several major trade corridors. The margin of error was now dangerously small. The report concluded with a recommendation. Immediate restructuring is advised. Failure to act within the next 5 cycles may result in cascading infrastructure failures across multiple trade sectors. The conclave scheduled a discussion. It lasted 6 hours. At the end of the session, the Grand Facilitator summarized the consensus. While the human analysis raises interesting considerations, he said diplomatically, the majority of delegations believe further study is required before implementing structural changes of this magnitude. The proposal was moved to the next agenda cycle. 3 months later, the Veth Dominion presented a comprehensive counter-analysis. It included 109 slides, and the humans listened, quietly, patiently, for 11 years, until the day Ambassador Yara OA stood up, closed her datapad, and walked out. The first failure occurred 23 days after the human delegation left the conclave station. At the time, no one realized what it meant. In the Talron corridor, one of the busiest freight routes in the outer trade sectors, a navigation control array temporarily shut down. The shutdown lasted only 47 seconds, long enough for 3 cargo carriers to receive conflicting traffic signals. One vessel attempted an emergency drop from transit space. Another delayed its exit by 4 seconds. The third never received the updated routing command at all. The result was not a collision. Modern ships were far too advanced for something so crude. Instead, all 3 vessels were forced into automatic safety lockdowns. Traffic halted. Thousands of ships behind them were forced to slow. Within 20 minutes, a queue of cargo traffic stretched across nearly 2 light hours of the corridor. Technicians quickly restored the navigation array. Traffic resumed. Reports were filed. Engineers blamed a routine software fault. The incident was classified as a minor disruption. No one at the conclave paid much attention. Not yet. 2 days later, the second failure occurred. This time in the Corval Hub, one of the central junctions that handled freight redistribution across 6 major trade regions. The hub's scheduling network began receiving contradictory cargo manifests. Ships arriving at the hub were assigned docking lanes that were already occupied. Other vessels received departure clearances for routes that had not been prepared. At first, the system attempted to compensate. Routing algorithms shifted traffic around the congestion. Backup processors activated. Redundant systems tried to stabilize the flow. For several hours, the hub's infrastructure fought to maintain control. Then a cargo convoy from the Rimward systems arrived 40 minutes ahead of schedule. The scheduling network recalculated. The recalculation forced several hundred ships to delay their departures. Those delays cascaded outward. Ships waiting to leave the hub could not move. Ships waiting to arrive had nowhere to dock. Traffic began backing up through multiple corridors. By the time engineers stabilized the system, more than 12,000 vessels were waiting for routing clearance. The backlog took 3 days to resolve. Once again, reports were filed. Once again, the conclusion was reassuring. Temporary logistical congestion. System functioning within acceptable tolerance. At the conclave, the events were discussed briefly during a trade oversight meeting. A delegate from the Heron Coalition mentioned the disruptions. The Veth Dominion representative responded with mild irritation. Minor fluctuations in traffic efficiency are inevitable in a network of this scale. Several other delegations agreed. Interstellar trade involved millions of shipments every cycle. Occasional delays were not unusual. The discussion moved on. 4 days later, the third failure occurred. This one could not be ignored. In the Vazari Transit Gate, a major long-distance corridor used by nearly 20% of the galaxy's commercial traffic, the navigation lattice overloaded. The gate's processors attempted to route more ships simultaneously than its architecture had been designed to handle. The overload lasted less than 2 seconds. But that was enough. 16 ships were forced out of transit space simultaneously. Not into open space. Into the staging buffer surrounding the gate. The buffer had been designed for 5 ships. 16 vessels emerging at once created a cascade of automated safety responses. Emergency shutdowns triggered. Docking fields collapsed. Traffic in the corridor froze instantly. Within minutes, hundreds of ships were trapped in holding patterns across multiple star systems. Freight convoys waiting to enter the corridor received delay notices. Then cancellation orders. Then silence. Across the trade network, logistics companies began reporting something unusual. Schedules were no longer stabilizing. Delays in one corridor were now affecting routes thousands of light-years away. Cargo shipments began arriving days late. Then weeks. Insurance rates spiked. Markets reacted. Prices for critical materials surged across several sectors. And still, the conclave moved slowly. Committees requested detailed reports. Technical analysts debated the probability models. Some delegations began reviewing old infrastructure reports. Others called for new simulations. In a quiet archive deep within the conclave station, an assistant analyst opened a file that had not been accessed in nearly 2 years. It was a human report, 30,000 pages long. The analyst skimmed through the executive summary. Then the projected failure timeline. Then the traffic simulations. His sensory membranes tightened slightly, because the numbers in the report matched the events now unfolding across the trade network. Almost exactly. He read one particular line again. When system capacity exceeds 97% utilization, cascading failures will begin within 30 standard days. The analyst checked the date. The first corridor failure had occurred 23 days after the humans left. His appendages moved quickly across the console. He opened the session records from the last conclave meeting. The Veth presentation. Slide 72. And suddenly he understood something that made the air in the archive feel very cold. The humans had not left in frustration. They had left on a schedule. Far across the galaxy, in a quiet solar system that most civilizations still called by its ancient name, Earth. Ambassador Yara O'A stood on the balcony of a diplomatic complex overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Marcus Hale stepped beside her. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. Finally Marcus glanced at the datapad in his hand. "The first corridor collapsed," he said. Yara nodded slightly. "How long until they realize?" Marcus checked the next report. "Not long," he said quietly, "because the next failure was going to be much bigger." The fourth failure did not occur in a corridor. It occurred in the center of the network. The Oridan Nexus had been built 240 years earlier and was considered one of the greatest engineering achievements in the history of the Conclave. 12 major corridors intersected there, feeding cargo traffic into nearly a third of the galaxy's commercial routes. Millions of shipments passed through the Nexus every cycle. For centuries, it had functioned perfectly. Until the morning its scheduling core tried to process traffic from 14,000 ships at once. The original architecture had been designed for 8,000. The system attempted to compensate. Priority queues activated. Cargo shipments carrying medical supplies, reactor fuel, and food reserves were pushed forward in the schedule. Other shipments were delayed. That delay pushed ships backward into surrounding corridors. Those corridors were already operating near their limits. Within 20 minutes, the Nexus was no longer routing traffic. It was trying to survive. Emergency processors activated. Redundant navigation arrays came online. Automated freight algorithms began rewriting schedules in real time. But every correction created another imbalance somewhere else. One corridor slowed. Another overflowed. A third began rejecting incoming ships entirely. Across the Nexus control deck, dozens of engineers stared at their consoles in disbelief. "What is the traffic load?" one supervisor demanded. 212% of safe capacity, a technician replied. "That's impossible. It's what the system is reporting." "Shut down the outer corridors." "We can't." "Why not?" "Because those corridors are now holding over 40,000 ships waiting for entry." The supervisor stared at the numbers for a long moment. Then he asked the question every engineer eventually asks when systems begin failing. "When did this start?" The technician opened the traffic logs. 27 days ago. At the Conclave station, the atmosphere inside the diplomatic chamber had changed dramatically. The slow, patient tone of the previous sessions had vanished. Delegates spoke rapidly now. Some even interrupted each other. Large displays across the hall showed live trade network reports. Corridors flashing red. Traffic delays measured in weeks instead of hours. Shipping companies filing emergency claims. Entire sectors reporting shortages of industrial materials that normally arrived in daily convoys. The Veth Dominion representative looked distinctly less confident than he had during his famous presentation. "This situation," he said carefully, "appears to be the result of several simultaneous infrastructure anomalies." A delegate from the Drell Systems Union responded immediately. 5 major hubs are now operating above maximum load. Yes, but that does not necessarily indicate. The Vazari Gate has shut down entirely. That is a temporary measure while technicians stabilize. And the Oridan Nexus is refusing incoming traffic. That statement silenced the chamber. Because everyone knew what the Nexus represented. If the Nexus stopped functioning, entire sections of the trade network would become unreachable. A transportation analyst projected a new map onto the central display. Red lines spread across the galaxy like fractures in glass. Current projections indicate system-wide congestion spreading across 17 major corridors, the analyst reported. "How long until stabilization?" the facilitator asked. The analyst hesitated. "That depends on whether the traffic load decreases." "And if it does not?" The analyst looked down at his console. "Then back up. The network will begin shutting down corridors automatically to prevent catastrophic overload." "How many corridors?" "At least 40. A ripple of alarm spread through the chamber. 40 corridors represented nearly a quarter of all interstellar trade routes. Entire economies depended on those connections. Food shipments, industrial supply chains, energy distribution. Without the network, thousands of colonies would begin experiencing shortages within weeks. One delegate finally asked the question that had been hanging over the chamber since the crisis began. What did the humans predict? The room fell silent again. Because everyone remembered the proposal now. The restructuring plan. The distributed relay network. The simulations that had shown exactly this type of cascading failure. A junior analyst from the archive division stepped forward nervously. He carried a datapad filled with documents that had not been reviewed in years. "These are the human projections," he said. The display changed. Graphs appeared. Traffic curves. Failure simulations. A timeline. Several delegates leaned forward. The analyst enlarged one particular chart. "According to this model," he said quietly, "once the network exceeds 97% capacity." He stopped speaking. "Continue," the facilitator said. "The collapse spreads exponentially." "How long until full failure?" The analyst checked the next page of the report, then looked up slowly. "Approximately 60 days." The chamber erupted into overlapping voices. Orders. Questions. Arguments. For the first time in 300 years, the conclave had a crisis that could not be delayed by committees. The grand facilitator raised all four hands. The room slowly quieted. "There is one obvious course of action," he said. Every delegate in the chamber knew what he meant, even before he said it. "We must contact humanity." On Earth, the message arrived less than an hour later. It was the most urgent communication the conclave had transmitted in decades. Marcus Hale read the message twice. Then he handed the datapad to Ambassador Yara Oa. "They want our help," he said. Yara looked out across the ocean again. Ships moved slowly along the horizon. Human cargo vessels. Small ones, compared to the giants that traveled the interstellar corridors. "They always did," she said quietly. Marcus frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Yara handed the datapad back. "They wanted our help," she said. "They just didn't want to listen." Marcus checked the message again. The conclave had requested immediate negotiations. Emergency restructuring of the trade network. Human engineering support. Technical leadership. Everything the humans had proposed 11 years earlier. He looked up at her. "What do we tell them?" Yara smiled very slightly. "For now." She turned toward the building behind them. "We let them wait." The second message from the conclave arrived 6 hours later. The tone had changed. The first transmission had carried the formal language of diplomatic urgency, carefully structured requests, polite phrasing, and the assumption that negotiations would proceed in the usual way. The second message was shorter, and far less confident. Trade network instability continues to escalate. The conclave formally requests immediate consultation with human logistical authorities. Marcus Hale read the message in silence. Across the room, several human analysts worked at large display tables, monitoring the same network traffic reports that were flooding into conclave control systems. Corridors flashing red. Hubs shutting down. Cargo fleets drifting in holding patterns across entire sectors of space. A young analyst looked up from her console. "Oridan Nexus just dropped to emergency routing mode," she said. Marcus nodded slowly. "How long until full lock?" 16 hours, she replied. He turned back to the message. It had taken the conclave 27 days to ask for help. That was faster than Marcus had expected. He tapped the screen and opened a live feed from the collapsing trade network. Ships everywhere. Millions of them. Freight carriers waiting for routing clearance. Convoys halted outside transit gates. Supply lines stretching thin across dozens of star systems. Somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, the human proposal from 11 years earlier sat quietly in the archives of the conclave. Ignored. Unimplemented. Perfectly accurate. Behind him, the door opened. Ambassador Yara Oa entered the room carrying a cup of coffee. "Second message?" she asked. Marcus handed her the datapad. She read it quickly. Then she set it down on the table beside the other reports. "They're still being polite," she observed. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Should they not be?" Yara shrugged slightly. "Politeness usually disappears around day 40. Marcus glanced back at the network feed. "What happens on day 40? "Food shipments start failing." He didn't reply. Because they both knew she was right. The outer colonies relied on constant freight deliveries to survive. Agricultural worlds exported enormous quantities of food across the trade network every cycle. If those shipments stopped arriving, the consequences would not remain economic for long. Yara walked toward the central display and studied the latest traffic projections. "How bad?" she asked. Marcus enlarged a chart. 22% of corridors now operating in emergency traffic mode. Projected failures: 46 corridors within the next 30 days. Yara nodded slowly. "Almost exactly what we predicted." Across the room, another analyst spoke up. "The conclave is requesting a live conference." Marcus glanced toward Yara. She considered the request for a moment. Then she sighed softly. "All right," she said. "Let's see how desperate they are." The conclave chamber looked very different from the last time the humans had seen it. The massive displays that normally showed trade statistics and diplomatic schedules were now filled with crisis maps. Red warning indicators blinked across the galaxy. Delegates spoke in tense clusters around the chamber. Several species had begun transmitting emergency messages to their home systems. The Grand Facilitator stood at the center podium. When the human communication link activated, the room fell silent. Yara and Marcus appeared on the central projection. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the facilitator inclined his head respectfully. "Ambassador OA," he said. "Thank you for accepting our request." Yara nodded politely. "Of course." The facilitator gestured toward the displays surrounding the chamber. "As you are undoubtedly aware, the trade network is experiencing significant instability." Marcus said nothing. Yara simply waited. The facilitator continued. "Several delegations believe that humanity may possess expertise relevant to resolving this crisis." That was one way of describing it. Another way would have been, humanity predicted this entire situation 11 years ago. But the facilitator was an experienced diplomat. He chose his words carefully. The Veth Dominion representative stepped forward. For the first time since humanity had joined the conclave, his posture carried a hint of uncertainty. "Ambassador," he said, "your earlier infrastructure proposal included models addressing large-scale corridor congestion." Yara folded her hands calmly. "Yes." The Veth delegate hesitated before continuing. "Would humanity be willing to assist the conclave in stabilizing the current situation?" The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. Hundreds of alien species waited for the answer. Because by now, the truth had become painfully obvious. No one else had predicted the collapse. No one else had prepared a solution. And the only species that understood the system well enough to fix it was the one they had ignored for 11 years. Marcus glanced at Yara. She looked thoughtful for a moment. Then she spoke. "Humanity is always willing to help solve engineering problems." Relief spread visibly through the chamber. But she had not finished speaking. "However," she continued calmly, "there are certain conditions." The relief vanished. "Conditions?" the facilitator asked carefully. Yara nodded. "Yes." Because if humanity was going to rebuild the galaxy's trade network, they were going to do it their way. The conclave chamber remained completely silent. Not the quiet of boredom that had filled the room during the Veth presentations. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that comes when hundreds of powerful civilizations realize they are no longer in control of a situation. Ambassador Yara Oi waited calmly. She had learned long ago that the most powerful tool in diplomacy was patience. Eventually, the Grand Facilitator spoke. "What conditions does humanity require?" Yara glanced briefly at Marcus. He nodded once. She returned her attention to the chamber. "The current trade infrastructure must be rebuilt," she said. That statement alone caused a ripple of unease across the delegates. Rebuilt. Not repaired. Not adjusted. Rebuilt. Yara continued. "The hub-based corridor system is fundamentally unstable at the scale the galaxy now operates. Attempting to stabilize it will only delay the collapse." The Veth representative shifted slightly. "Our engineers believe several targeted upgrades could." "No," Yara said gently. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt rudely. But the word carried the calm certainty of someone who had spent 11 years studying a problem. The system is failing because its architecture is wrong. A large display appeared beside her image. Marcus had activated the simulation. A map of the galactic trade network filled the chamber. Bright lines connected thousands of star systems. Large glowing nodes marked the central hubs. As the delegates watched, the simulation advanced. Traffic increased. Cargo routes thickened. Then the first hub turned red. Then another. Then 5 more. The network began collapsing inward like a chain of falling structures. The simulation ended. Marcus activated the next model. This one looked very different. Instead of massive hubs, thousands of smaller relay nodes appeared across the map. Traffic flowed through flexible pathways rather than central bottlenecks. When the simulation advanced, traffic increased again. Ships moved through the system in constantly shifting chains. No single point carried enough load to collapse. The network flexed, adjusted, continued operating. This, Yara said quietly, is the distributed relay model humanity proposed 11 years ago. No one spoke, because everyone in the chamber understood what they were seeing. The solution had been sitting in the conclave archives the entire time. Ignored, debated, buried beneath committees and presentations. Until the system began breaking exactly the way the humans had predicted. The Grand Facilitator cleared his throat. You are proposing we implement the human design immediately? Yes. That would require rebuilding a large portion of the existing infrastructure. Yes. And placing the network under human logistical management during the transition. Yara nodded. That is the second condition. Murmurs spread across the chamber. Several powerful delegations began speaking to each other in quiet tones. Control of the trade network was not a small matter. It was the backbone of the galactic economy. For centuries, no single species had dominated its operation. Power had been distributed among multiple alliances. Now the humans were asking for something unprecedented. Temporary command over the most important logistical system in the galaxy. The Veth representative finally spoke. Ambassador, he said cautiously, surely there are alternative arrangements that would allow the conclave to maintain. Yara raised a hand slightly. Marcus changed the display again. This time it showed a timeline. Corridor failures. Hub overloads. Projected shortages across dozens of colonies. And one particularly alarming projection. Food supply interruptions within 40 days. Every hour we spend debating, Yara said calmly, the system becomes harder to save. The chamber grew quiet again. Because everyone could see the numbers. The collapse was accelerating. Committees would not fix it. Reports would not fix it. And the only working solution currently available belonged to humanity. The Grand Facilitator studied the projections for a long moment. Then he looked back at the human ambassadors. Your third condition, he asked. Yara almost smiled. Because this was the one that mattered most. All future large-scale infrastructure planning will include a permanent human engineering council. A few delegates looked confused. Others looked thoughtful. Marcus explained. Humans are very good at long-term systems planning, he said. We tend to design things based on how people will actually use them, not how we hope they will behave. The Veth representative lowered his gaze slightly, because that sentence contained a quiet criticism of the entire conclave. For 3 centuries, the galaxy had designed systems based on political compromise. Humans designed systems based on reality. The Grand Facilitator finally spoke again. And if the conclave accepts these conditions? Yara's answer was simple. Then humanity will save the trade network. A long silence followed. Delegates whispered. Calculations ran across dozens of datapads. The decision before them was enormous. But the alternative was far worse. Finally, the facilitator straightened. For 300 years, he said slowly, the conclave has existed to protect the stability of the galaxy. He looked around the chamber. At the crisis displays. At the collapsing network projections. then back at the humans. Today, he said quietly, that stability depends on humanity. He paused, and then he spoke the words that would change the balance of power in the galaxy. The Conclave accepts your terms. The first thing humanity did was shut things down. Not everything, but enough to make the entire galaxy nervous. Within 12 hours of the Conclave accepting the terms, Human Logistics Command transmitted a priority directive across the trade network. 43 corridors were ordered into controlled suspension. Traffic froze. Convoys halted. Cargo ships already in transit were diverted into holding zones. Across hundreds of systems, captains stared at their consoles in disbelief. The network had never been deliberately slowed like this before. Not on such a scale. At the conclave, several delegates reacted immediately. The Veth Dominion representative spoke first. You are shutting down nearly 1/4 of the galaxy's active trade routes. Marcus Hale appeared on the chamber display. Yes. That will worsen the congestion. Marcus shook his head. No, he said calmly. It will stop the collapse. Behind him, massive data walls filled the Human Logistics Command Center. Thousands of engineers worked at consoles. Traffic simulations moved constantly across the displays. Corridor loads. Ship positions. Cargo priority lists. The conclave had expected humans to provide advice. What they had not expected was how quickly humans moved. Your network is overloaded because it was designed to push everything through a few major hubs, Marcus explained. So we're removing the hubs. The chamber fell silent. What? The Veth delegate asked. Marcus changed the display. The old trade network appeared. Large glowing nodes connected dozens of corridors. He highlighted them one by one. Oridan Nexus. Koval Hub. Talran Junction. These locations process more traffic than the rest of the network combined. Another display appeared beside it. Hundreds of smaller points spread across the map. Instead of routing ships through a few central hubs, Marcus continued, we're building relay chains. The simulation began running. Traffic flowed through dozens of smaller pathways instead of converging on a single point. Ships moved system to system like links in a living chain. Flexible. Adaptive. No bottlenecks. The Grand Facilitator leaned forward slightly. You are rebuilding the entire traffic model. Marcus nodded. Yes. And you can do this quickly enough to stop the collapse? Marcus allowed himself a small smile. We already started 11 years ago. Across the galaxy, the first relay stations began activating. Most of them were not new. They had been quietly constructed by human engineering teams over the past decade. At the time, other species had assumed they were minor logistical outposts. Small navigation platforms. Maintenance stations. Emergency depots. Now those quiet little stations began linking together. One by one. Like lights turning on across the dark. Cargo ships received new routing instructions. Instead of heading toward the massive hubs, they were directed through relay chains of smaller stations. At first, captains were confused. The routes looked longer, more complicated. But as the hours passed, something remarkable happened. Traffic began moving again. Ships that had been trapped in holding patterns for days started receiving clearance. Corridors that had been dangerously overloaded began dropping below critical levels. Engineers monitoring the system started noticing something else. The network was stabilizing. Not slowly. Rapidly. At the conclave, the analysts updated the projections. Red warning indicators disappeared from several corridors. Yellow alerts replaced them. Then green. The Vazari transit gate reopened. The Talran corridor resumed traffic flow. Even the Oridan Nexus, the largest hub in the network, began operating safely again. Because it was no longer carrying the weight of the entire galaxy. For the first time in weeks, the trade network was breathing again. The Grand Facilitator watched the recovery data in amazement. How long until full stabilization? He asked. A human engineer appeared beside Marcus on the display. 32 hours, she said. The chamber erupted into stunned whispers. 32 hours, the facilitator repeated. The engineer nodded. The network was never the problem. What do you mean? She pointed to the simulation. The system had enough infrastructure to support the traffic. Then why did it collapse? Because it was designed inefficiently. The answer was almost embarrassingly simple. 3 centuries of political compromise had produced a network that looked impressive, but functioned poorly. Human engineers had spent 11 years redesigning it quietly. Now the galaxy was watching that design come to life. Ships began moving again. Supply convoys resumed. Food shipments reached colonies that had been days away from shortages. Markets stabilized. Insurance prices dropped. Across thousands of star systems, people realized something extraordinary had just happened. The galaxy had faced a crisis capable of collapsing its entire economy. And a single species had solved it in less than 2 days. At the conclave, the Veth representative studied the recovery reports for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. "We should have listened." The Grand Facilitator nodded slowly. "Yes. Because for the first time since humanity joined the conclave, every species in the chamber understood something very clearly. Humans were not just another young civilization. They were the species that could fix the galaxy's biggest problems. 30 hours after humanity took control of the trade network, the crisis was over. Not contained. Not delayed. Over. Across the galaxy, corridor traffic returned to stable levels. Cargo convoys resumed their schedules. Freight hubs that had been days away from catastrophic overload were now operating comfortably within safe limits. The network was no longer struggling to survive. It was functioning better than it ever had before. The distributed relay system had changed everything. Ships no longer crowded into massive bottlenecks. Traffic flowed dynamically through thousands of smaller nodes that adjusted routes in real time. If one corridor slowed down, cargo automatically shifted through alternate chains. The system adapted, learned, balanced itself. 300 years of infrastructure had been redesigned in less than 2 days. And the species responsible for that miracle had predicted the entire crisis 11 years earlier. At the conclave chamber, the mood had transformed completely. The panic and urgency that had filled the hall during the crisis were gone. Now the delegates watched the traffic displays with something closer to quiet awe. The recovery reports continued updating across the massive screens. Corridor stability, 100%. Cargo delay backlog, clearing. Projected network capacity increase, 340%. A logistics analyst from the Drell Systems Union studied the numbers carefully. Then he looked up at the chamber. The system is now capable of handling nearly 4 times the previous traffic volume. Murmurs spread across the hall. 4 times. That meant the galaxy's economy could grow far beyond its previous limits. Colonies could expand. Trade routes could multiply. Entire sectors that had been restricted by infrastructure limitations were now open. The Grand Facilitator turned toward the human representatives displayed on the central projection. "Ambassador OA," he said, "the conclave owes humanity a considerable debt." Yara OA shook her head gently. "We solved a problem." The facilitator smiled slightly. "You solved the problem." Across the chamber, the Veth Dominion representative stepped forward. For the first time since his famous presentation weeks earlier, his posture looked almost humble. "Ambassador," he said slowly, "the Dominion would like to formally acknowledge that our earlier analysis was incorrect." Several delegates glanced toward him in mild surprise. The Veth were not known for public admissions of error. Yara inclined her head politely. "Engineering problems are complicated," she said. The Veth representative hesitated. Then he added something unexpected. The Dominion would also like to request access to human logistical training programs. Marcus Hale allowed himself a small grin. "That can be arranged." Around the chamber, other delegates began speaking with their neighbors. Requests for technical cooperation, infrastructure partnerships, joint planning councils. For 11 years, humanity had been treated as an enthusiastic but inexperienced newcomer. Now the tone had shifted. Now the galaxy was asking how humans did what they did. Because solving the crisis had revealed something far more important than engineering skill. It had revealed the way humans thought. While the rest of the conclave had debated politics and precedent, humans had studied the system. Quietly, patiently, and when the collapse finally began, they already knew exactly how to fix it. Later that evening, the Grand Facilitator reviewed the final report from the Crisis Response Committee. He read the summary twice, then leaned back in his chair. A young aide stood nearby. "Is something wrong?" the aide asked. The facilitator shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Something is very right." He turned the report toward the aide. At the top of the document was a simple statement written by the conclave analysts. Humanity solved the greatest logistical crisis in modern galactic history in 30 hours. The aide read the line again. "Impressive," he said. The facilitator smiled faintly. "You misunderstand." "How so?" The facilitator tapped the report with one of his hands. "They didn't solve it in 30 hours. The aide looked confused. "But the crisis ended yesterday." "Yes. But the humans began solving it 11 years ago." The room grew quiet, because that was the part that truly mattered. The galaxy had just witnessed the moment when humanity revealed its greatest strength. Not superior weapons, not superior wealth, not superior technology. Something far more dangerous. Humans planned for problems before they happened. And when everyone else ignored the warnings, humans prepared anyway. Across the galaxy, millions of cargo ships continued moving through the new relay network. Trade flowed faster than it ever had before. Entire civilizations would benefit from the change. And somewhere in the conclave archives, the original human proposal still existed. The one submitted 11 years earlier. 30,000 pages. Every prediction accurate. Every solution correct. Ignored until the moment it saved the galaxy. 3 months after the crisis ended, the conclave chamber filled again. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. Where once the hall had echoed with endless debate and patient bureaucracy, now there was a quiet sense of focus. Delegates arrived earlier. Reports were read more carefully. Technical briefings were taken far more seriously than before. Because the galaxy had learned something important. Ignoring problems did not make them disappear. The conclave's central display lit up with the latest trade network statistics. Cargo traffic had increased by 38% since the relay system went online. Transit delays were the lowest in recorded history. Entire sectors that had once been considered difficult to reach were now thriving trade zones. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy's infrastructure was ahead of its growth instead of struggling behind it. And at the center of that transformation was a small section of the chamber that had once been easy to overlook. The human delegation table. 8 chairs. 8 datapads. 8 small flags. Ambassador Yara Oa sat calmly at the center seat, reviewing a technical report while the chamber slowly filled. Marcus Hale leaned back slightly in his chair. "You realize," he said quietly, "they're watching us now." Yara didn't look up. "They always were." Marcus gestured subtly across the chamber. Delegates from dozens of species were glancing toward the human section. Not with curiosity. With attention. With respect. The Veth Dominion representative approached the table. This time, he did not wait for the humans to notice him. He stopped beside them and inclined his upper body slightly. "Ambassador Oa," he said. Yara looked up. "Representative." The Veth delegate placed a datapad on the table. "The Dominion has completed its review of the relay network architecture." Yara glanced at the document. "And?" The Veth representative paused. "We would like to formally adopt the design for our internal transportation systems." Marcus chuckled softly. "That's quite an endorsement." The Veth delegate did not react to the humor. "It is an acknowledgement of effective engineering." Yara nodded once. "We're happy to share the framework." The representative hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "There is another matter." "Yes." "The Dominion would like to sponsor humanity for permanent leadership within the Conclave Infrastructure Council." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's a significant shift in policy." "Yes," the Veth representative said simply. Circumstances have changed. Across the chamber, the Grand Facilitator called the session to order. Delegates took their seats. The room settled into attentive silence. The facilitator glanced briefly toward the human table before beginning the session. For 300 years, he said, the conclave has guided the development of our shared civilization. He gestured toward the massive displays showing the thriving trade network. Recent events have reminded us that progress requires more than discussion. A faint ripple of amusement passed through the chamber, because everyone knew exactly what he meant. Progress, the facilitator continued, requires foresight. He paused. And sometimes, it requires listening to the youngest species in the room. Several delegates turned their gaze toward the human section again. Yara noticed, but she simply returned her attention to her datapad. Marcus leaned closer. You know, he said quietly, 11 years ago they thought we were naive. Yara allowed herself a small smile. 11 years ago, she replied, they thought the system worked. The session agenda appeared on the central display. The first item read, Infrastructure Planning, Long-Term Expansion. A human engineer stepped forward to present the opening report. Not because the conclave had given humanity special treatment, but because when the galaxy needed someone to design the future, they now knew exactly who to ask. Later that evening, in the quiet archive levels beneath the conclave chamber, a young analyst reviewed historical records from the crisis. He had been studying the original human proposal again. 30,000 pages. Thousands of simulations. Every prediction precise. He scrolled slowly through the document until he reached the introduction. The first sentence caught his attention. It was written in simple, direct language. Large systems fail when no one is responsible for fixing them. The analyst leaned back in his chair. Above him, the conclave station continued its endless orbit around the neutral star at the center of diplomatic space. For centuries, the galaxy had believed that stability came from shared responsibility, from committees, from consensus. But the crisis had revealed something different. Sometimes the most valuable civilization in the room was the one that quietly solved the problems everyone else was still arguing about. And after what had happened to the trade network, no one in the galaxy would ever underestimate humanity again.